It was the dead of night when I clocked in for my shift at McDonald's. The kind of shift that most people avoided, the one that started at 11 p.m. and ended at 4 a.m. I hated it, but I needed the cash. This McDonald's was in a small, quiet town where nothing ever happened, at least that's what I thought. I worked the drive-thru. The hours were slow, and most of the time, I was just staring at the screen, listening to the hum of the machines in the kitchen behind me. But tonight was different. There was a strange energy in the air. It started with a car that pulled up just after midnight. It was a black sedan, but not like any car I'd ever seen before. It looked old. The kind of car you would expect to see in a junkyard, not on a main road. But I figured maybe it was someone's grandfather's car, some relic from another time. The man who got out was tall, too tall for a normal person. His face was pale, almost ashen, and his eyes, they were hollow, couldn't look away. He didn't speak when he approached the window, just stared at me. His lips slightly curled in what I could only describe as a twisted smile. I felt my heart skip a beat. He finally broke the silence, his voice low and raspy. "I'll have a large fries and a special order." I froze for a second. "A special order?" I repeated. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yes, it's for someone special." A cold chill ran down my spine. I had worked here long enough to know that special orders usually meant something strange or off the menu. I didn't ask any more questions. I entered the order into the system, but when I hit the button to send it to the kitchen, the screen flickered for a split second. I could have sworn I saw something flash, something that didn't belong. "Your fries will be ready shortly," I said, trying to shake the feeling creeping over me. He didn't respond, just stood there, looking at me like he was waiting for something more. I handed the man his fries when they were ready, trying to ignore the unease that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The guy didn't even look at them when I passed them through the window. He just stared at me, his fingers tapping the edge of the window frame with a steady rhythm, like he was trying to convey some kind of message through that small action. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, feeling like I was in a trance. He didn't speak, but he slid a piece of paper across the counter. It was torn at the edges, and it had a strange, unrecognizable symbol scribbled on it in dark ink. The ink seemed too dark, almost as if it had been freshly applied, still damp. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly. "Who is this for?" I asked, trying to keep the shaking out of my voice. He didn't answer, just stood there, unmoving, his gaze never leaving mine. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity before he finally turned and walked back to his car. But something was off about the way he moved. It wasn't natural. He didn't open the car door like a normal person. Instead, he glided into the seat, almost like he was floating. And when the car started up, the engine sounded wrong. Too smooth, like it wasn't a real car at all. I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring after him as he drove away. The air felt colder, the night darker, but something in my gut told me I wasn't done with him. The whole encounter, the odd symbols, the way he moved, it was all wrong. I stared at the piece of paper in my hand, feeling the weight of it like a brick in my palm. The strange symbol on it seemed to be pulsing, like it was alive. I don't know why, but I opened it. Maybe I thought I'd find some explanation, or maybe I was just too curious to resist. The paper was covered in more symbols now, like they were drawn in a rush, but the most disturbing part was the last sentence. "He's not gone." I stood there, staring at the paper in my hand, my mind racing. "He's not gone." Those words echoed in my head like a haunting chant, and for the first time that night, I felt truly afraid. I shoved the paper into my pocket, hoping it would somehow lose its power if I couldn't see it. But the fear didn't go away. The air around me was heavy, charged with something I couldn't explain. I tried to shake it off, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the man and his strange, unsettling presence. Around 1:30 a.m., the lobby was empty, and the drive-thru had quieted down. The occasional car would pass, but there were no other customers. I tried to focus on the monotonous tasks of cleaning, mopping the floors, and checking the stock. But I couldn't stop glancing out the window, half expecting that black sedan to pull up again. And then it happened. The same car, the same man, pulled up to the drive-through window. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, the car didn't glide smoothly to a stop. It screeched like it was struggling to come to a halt. The engine sounded worse than before, rougher, like it was malfunctioning. I walked slowly to the window, my palms sweating as I approached, the sensation of dread intensifying with every step. I could feel his presence before I even looked at him. His shadow cast long and twisted across the floor as he stood at the counter, staring at me through the window with those hollow, unblinking eyes. He didn't say a word this time, just stared. And then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hand to the window and tapped 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of it was sharp, echoing in the silence of the store. My pulse quickened as I reached for the window handle, but my hand hesitated. It wasn't like before. Something in his expression, or maybe his stillness, told me that I shouldn't open the window. But I had to. Pulled it open. He didn't ask for anything this time. He just reached into the bag on the passenger seat, pulled out a small, sealed envelope, and slid it through the gap between us. I didn't touch it right away. I didn't want to. I was too scared. But he waited. His fingers brushed against mine as I reluctantly took the envelope, his grip cold, like he wasn't human at all. The chill shot through me, making my skin crawl. When I stepped back, I opened the envelope. Inside, there was another note, but this one was different. It was crisp and neat, typed out in a font I didn't recognize, the edges of the paper jagged, as though it had been torn from a larger sheet. The note read, "You've seen too much." I stood frozen, holding the note in my trembling hands. The words "you've seen too much" were burned into my mind, but what scared me even more than that was the feeling of being watched. The air around me was thick, suffocating. It felt like something was pressing down on my chest, but when I glanced around the store, everything seemed perfectly normal, almost too normal. The man was gone. The car had disappeared, leaving only the distant hum of the night. The drive-through lane was empty, but something had shifted in the space between the windows, as if he had left a mark, an imprint that couldn't be erased. I pocketed the note quickly, unwilling to look at it any longer. I wanted to burn it, forget it, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man would return, that the words on the note were a warning, a prophecy of something worse to come. I continued working, wiping down tables, cleaning up the counter, trying to distract myself, but every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see his black sedan pulling into the lot again. Around 3 a.m., when I thought the worst of it was over, the lights in the restaurant flickered. At first, I thought it was just the usual power surge that sometimes happened during the night shift. But then the lights flickered again, and again. Each time, it seemed like the darkness inside the store was growing deeper, thicker, as if the shadows themselves were reaching out, curling around the edges of the room, pulling the light back into itself. I didn't know how to explain it, but I felt the shift in the air, a sensation of being trapped in something too dark to understand, but too real to ignore. That's when the door opened. It wasn't a customer. No one had come in for hours. The door opened, and there was no one there. The bell above it rang once, but it wasn't the sound of someone entering. It was a hollow, echoing noise, like a warning. I approached the door cautiously, my heartbeat loud in my ears. But when I looked outside, I saw nothing. Just the empty parking lot, bathed in the eerie glow of the streetlights. The night felt too quiet now. And then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like metal dragging across the floor. But it wasn't coming from inside the restaurant. It was coming from the kitchen. I crept toward the back, slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. As I passed the fryer station, I saw the faintest shadow move across the doorway. The scraping continued, growing louder, more desperate. I stepped into the kitchen, my breath catching in my throat. The fryer was on, but there was something wrong. The oil inside was still untouched, even though the fryer was supposed to be cooking. And then, behind the machine, I saw it, something moving just out of sight. I stepped closer, the chill in the air becoming unbearable. felt like something was waiting for me. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, my heart leaping in my throat. But there was no one there. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the figure standing at the doorway. The man. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark. His lips twisted into that same horrifying grin. This time he spoke. "You shouldn't have stayed." And I knew in that instant, with a clarity that cut through all the fear and confusion, that I wasn't alone in this place anymore. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place by a fear that was too overwhelming to ignore. I could feel the man's presence behind me, as if he were inches away, breathing down my neck. The temperature in the kitchen dropped drastically, and I could see my own breath misting in front of me, despite the fact that the air conditioning was off and the fryers had been running. He didn't move, just stood there, his hollow eyes watching me as if waiting for me to do something. Anything. The silence was suffocating, each second stretched into eternity. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out, like there was a weight pressing against my chest, choking me. I tried to turn, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Then the lights flickered again, this time longer, almost as if the power was going to fail entirely. A wave of panic washed over me. The deep, suffocating feeling of being trapped in this nightmarish place surged. I needed to get out of there. But how? How could I escape when everything in me screamed that this man wasn't just a person? I slowly turned around, and to my horror, the man was closer. In a blink, he had moved from the doorway to just a few feet away. I could hear him breathing now, gasping, ragged breaths that didn't sound like they belonged to a human. Before I could react, the kitchen door slammed shut, cutting off my escape. The sound echoed in the small room, the metallic clang reverberating through the walls. My mind raced, scrambling for something to do, anything to survive this. I reached for the phone to call for help, but the screen was cracked, displaying only static. I was completely alone. The kitchen was silent now, but I could feel something far more dangerous than just the man. Lurking in the shadows, creeping closer. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Just leave me alone." But the man didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand, the fingers long and unnaturally thin, pointing directly at me. Suddenly, I felt a sharp, painful tug at my chest, like an invisible hand was gripping my heart, squeezing it tighter with each passing second. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just physical. It was soul deep, something that went beyond anything I had ever felt before. And then, in a voice that felt like it was coming from somewhere far away, the man spoke again, this time in a whisper so low I barely heard it. "You've opened the door." I don't know what he meant, but the fear in his voice sent another jolt of terror through me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room around me seemed to pulse with darkness, the shadows closing in like a living thing, pressing against me, suffocating me. My vision began to blur, and I thought for sure I was going to pass out from the sheer pressure. But then, as quickly as it had started, the grip on my chest released. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my head spinning. The kitchen was still eerily quiet. I dared to glance up, but the man was gone. I don't know how long I stayed there on the cold, tiled floor, but when I finally managed to get up, I ran. I ran without thinking, bursting through the back door and into the parking lot, not caring where I went, just needing to get as far away as possible. The black sedan was gone. The parking lot was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I didn't stop running. Couldn't. My breath was ragged, my legs burning, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that place, from the restaurant, from him. My car was still parked in the lot, and I made a beeline for it, praying I wouldn't see that black sedan again. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to start the engine. The car sputtered, as if it were resisting, but finally roared to life. I sped out of the parking lot, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. Not once. The road stretched out before me, dark and desolate, and all I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between me and that cursed McDonald's. But the farther I drove, the more uneasy I became. The weight of the darkness, the memory of the man, followed me. No matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. As I approached the exit for my town, I saw something in my rearview mirror, a black sedan. It was too far back for me to make out clearly, but I could tell by the headlights, the shape, that it was the same car. I pressed my foot to the gas pedal, speeding up, my pulse racing. But the sedan didn't back off. It stayed behind me, like it was toying with me, like it was waiting for me to slip up. I reached the turnoff for my street, but something in my gut told me not to go home. Not yet. So I took a different route, a long loop around town, hoping I could lose the car. I glanced in my mirror every few seconds, but the sedan never wavered. It was still there, tailing me with disturbing persistence. And then I saw it. A street light ahead flickered. It wasn't just the light. It was the entire intersection. The world around me seemed to distort for a moment, like a glitch in reality itself. My vision blurred, and before I could even react, the black sedan was right behind me. Too close. I could feel its presence in a way I hadn't before. I slammed on the brakes, but it didn't matter. The sedan didn't slow down. Instead, it was like it merged with my car, the headlights consuming everything in front of me, blinding me. And then, with a sickening jolt, the impact came. But there was no crash, no shattering of glass or metal, just darkness. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath, my body soaked in sweat. My head was pounding, my heart racing. The first thing I noticed was that I was sitting in the driver's seat of my car, but it was parked back at the McDonald's. Couldn't believe it. My hands shook as I looked around, disoriented. The parking lot was still empty, the night still oppressive, but there was no sign of the sedan, no sign of anyone. I had to get out. I had to leave. But then I saw something, a small note pinned under my windshield wiper. The same dark ink, the same symbols, the same chilling words. "You can never leave." I wanted to scream, to drive away and never look back. But the words on the note, the feeling of the man's presence, I knew deep down that I couldn't escape. It wasn't just the McDonald's. It was something deeper, something that had followed me, something that had been waiting for me all along. As I stared at the note, the world around me began to fade again, the edges of reality warping. The last thing I heard before everything went black was a whisper, like the wind brushing against my ear. "Welcome back." I don't know how much time passed after that. My vision faded in and out, like I was slipping in and out of consciousness. The world around me became a blur of shadows and distorted lights, and my mind could hardly keep up with what was happening. When I opened my eyes again, the car was gone. I was no longer sitting in the driver's seat, no longer in the parking lot of McDonald's. The sound of distant traffic was the only thing I could hear, but the atmosphere felt thick, like I was trapped in some kind of dream. I stumbled out of the car, my legs unsteady, my body aching from the tension. It felt wrong, like I had crossed some invisible line, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do anymore. I looked around. Nothing was familiar. The street was empty. The buildings were tall, far too tall. The streets twisted in unnatural ways. It was the same place, but not. It was a version of my town, warped beyond recognition. The sky above was dark, darker than it had ever been before, and the air was still. There was no wind, no movement, just a suffocating silence. And then I heard it, a soft scrape like fingernails against stone. I turned slowly, my heart skipping a beat, and saw him, the man. But this time he was different. He wasn't just standing at the edge of the street. No, now he was closer, too close. He was walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes locked on mine. His smile had grown wider, stretching inhumanly across his face. His features were more pronounced now, hollow, sunken, as though he was made of something not entirely human. His presence felt like a weight on my chest, pressing down, suffocating me. "You didn't think you could leave, did you?" His voice rasped, like a whisper from the deepest part of hell. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body was frozen, rooted in place, as if something was holding me there. His gaze never wavered, his twisted smile never faltering. In a flash, I realized what was happening. I wasn't in my town anymore. This wasn't the world I knew. This place, this distorted, empty place was his world. The world where he existed. The world where he had been waiting for me. "You're mine now," he whispered, his voice slithering into my mind like poison. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My breath quickened as a dark, sickening realization set in. I would never escape. I had been chosen. The door had been opened, and now there was no closing it. I tried to run, to flee, but the more I moved, the more the world around me warped. The streets stretched out endlessly, the buildings towering impossibly high, the shadows consuming everything in their path. I turned back, and for a brief moment, I saw McDonald's again. But it wasn't the familiar building I once knew. It was darker, older, twisted. The golden arches had cracked, faded, as if time had consumed them. The lights inside flickered, casting long, eerie shadows through the windows. And then the man was there, standing in front of the door, blocking my way. His grin grew even wider, if that was even possible, and I could see something behind him. Something moving. The shadows in the window shifted, and I realized with a sinking feeling that there were more people inside. People I recognized. Faces from my past. Faces that weren't supposed to be there. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, as the figure stepped aside, letting me look into the depths of the restaurant. And that's when I knew McDonald's was no longer just a fast food joint. It was a place of torment, a place where the darkness had found its home. And once you stepped inside, there was no leaving. I couldn't fight it anymore, couldn't scream. The shadows were pulling me in. The man's voice was all around me, and I could feel my very soul being ripped apart. And then, everything went black.